In this video, I'll be talking about some of the common errors that I saw students making in their rule/law sections in a recent problem-solving assignment. So, common errors. The first error, which was quite common across the board, or more common than I would like it to be, was that some students use dot points or very short lists of cases rather than literally putting into a sentence what that particular principle entailed. So this is something that an error which might be made typically by a student who's problem solving for the very first time. So just keep in mind that we don't use dot points when it comes to solving legal problems. Everything is always in sentences, including your law section. And just putting a case name or just putting an element, say consideration, because I'm in contract law, yes, just doing that is not enough. It doesn't show me your knowledge. It doesn't tell me what principles you're going to be applying to those facts to resolve that problem. So make sure you have detail in your application section and use full sentences. The second common error that I saw more often than I would have liked to have was when students were outlining the rule or outlining the legal principles in their application section. And once again, this is an error which is typically made by a student who's problem solving for the first time, or it's one of the first times they've had a problem solving assignment. So you need to remember that the law needs to come first. And ultimately, when it comes to your problem solving, law and application might end up in the same paragraph, and you tend to do away with the IRAC headings, particularly when you move away from the first time that you've problem solved in your first law subject. But even when your sections become a little bit more entwined because you're all over the skills that you need and you're still hitting the mark even without having literally the separate titles, you need to make sure you're sufficiently outlining the law. What is the law? You can't just mash your law and application together per se, because then really what you're doing is just stating a conclusion, and stating a conclusion is not showing that you know how to outline the legal principles. It's stating a conclusion. Okay, so you need to separately outline what the legal principles are and then apply them, even if that law and application ultimately comes in the same paragraph. In terms of the third common error that I saw a little bit more often than I would have liked, it's when students aren't narrowing down on the contentious law in their law section. So they might be in the rough area, but they might be outlining principles which aren't directly relevant to the issue at hand, so aren't going to help them resolve the issue for their client. Alternatively, students might say in a contracts assignment, outline all the elements of contract formation when it's really only a consideration issue, or it's really only an intention issue. And so then what they've got is these great summaries of principles which aren't actually going to help them resolve the contentious issue at play. So those words are wasted to that extent. And if you think about what the marker's got in their marking guide, they'll have the law for the contentious issue. They're not going to have the law for every element. So whilst it doesn't necessarily mean that you have marks taken off, it means that you tend not to have a focused response, and you tend not to leave yourself enough words with the strict word counts that you have for developing your full explanation of what those principles are that help you resolve the contentious issue, and also it means that often you leave yourself short of words for your application section too. So in terms of outlining the law, if you can identify the issue, you only outline the law that helps you resolve that particular issue. So you have to be confident with your issue identification and run with it. In terms of a fourth common error that I saw a little bit more often than I would have liked, is to do with citations, to do with footnotes. So there were quite a few instances where case citations were missing for statements of legal principle. And sometimes I'd get a scenario where students would be citing the textbook for a direct quote from a case, or citing the textbook for a statement of a legal principle. but that's not sufficient here. You need to cite the law, which in contracts is cases typically. You need to cite those cases when you're stating a legal principle. So missing footnotes or footnoting a textbook for that statement rather than the case is not sufficient here. Okay, so if you're stating the law, you need to tell your marker where that law comes from. I already moved on to this one, the fifth one, which is around citations as well. So as I just mentioned, it's pretty common and was quite common. Maybe half the students in this particular cohort cited the textbook as if it's a primary source. So you need to remember that whilst the textbook is very useful for helping you to understand the principles, and whilst it might be where you start when you start drafting your response to a problem question, you need to remember though that the textbook is not a definitive statement of law. The definitive statements of law come from the cases themselves. So it's a secondary source, not a primary source of law. So cases and legislation should be what you're citing for legal principles, not secondary sources that might summarize them. Okay? All right. And now I just thought I'd show you an exemplar of a student response where the student did exactly what I needed them to do for this law section. Okay, so this issue involved communication of revocation and also an issue around a promise to keep an offer open and whether that amounted to an option contract. And if there was no option contract, it means that revocation of the offer was possible, but you still needed to look at whether communication of that revocation actually occurred prior to the contract's acceptance. So in terms of this exemplar here and the law that they've drawn upon, okay, so it's essential to discuss whether an offerer is legally bound to keep an offer open if the offeree asks for time. Okay, so here's the first issue that the student has identified. Okay, so what do our authorities tell us? Well, we've got a case reference here, and it states that a promise by the offerer not to revoke must be supported by consideration. Okay, so there's your legal principle, and then the student's connecting this principle to the follow-on principle around revocation. Okay, so if no option contract exists, the offerer is free to withdraw the offer unless acceptance has taken place. Okay, but for revocation to be effective, it has to happen before acceptance has occurred and after it's been, no, it has to be communicated, sorry. Okay, so here the student has the legal principle which helps them to resolve the first issue, the option contract issue. They also have the legal principles around the revocation issue and the communication of revocation, and they've also explained the relationship between the two. Okay, now the student could have also gone a little bit more detail in their case references. They could have also brought in Dickinson and Dodds, which is another key case in this area, but on the most part they've hit the mark. They've done what they needed to do. Okay, so law sections are not necessarily complicated if you're on track with your issue ID, but I think you still need to be quite systematic in how you approach them. Okay, thank you.